Yesterday my son was explaining to his two daughters, who are 5 and 2.5, that when he was their age, they didn't have a mouse for the computer. Both the kids were working on little computer things. I still don't know how a 2.5-year-old can operate a computer, but she can. Anyway. So he said, when I was your age, we didn't have a mouse for the computer. And Abby said, what did you use, Daddy? Did you just use your finger? And he said, no, I used a joystick. And then later a trackball. So Shirley and I looked at each other and we said, well, when we were your age, we used a stick pen until we got to grade 8, and only then were you allowed to use a fountain pen. I suspect some of you here this morning remember using slate and chalkboard. I don't know. But some of you. Most of you. Yeah, David says most of us. Okay. So times change, right? I just finished reading a book by, I think it's Robert Panek, Panek. And it's called The 4% Universe, subtitled something about the search for something, and the rest of reality. It's about the history of astronomy and the history of astrophysics, and the search for everything in the universe, all the way from Isaac Newton and even before that, Copernicus and Galileo and Isaac Newton understanding gravity for the first time. And then up to the recent century with Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity. Albert Einstein was the one who decided that light will bend when it's going around a massive object. And that was hard for people to believe that until we got to the point with our precision in science where we could look at light coming from distant stars past our sun. And we discovered that by taking sightings on this side of the sun, and then when we move the world around a bit on the other side, well, we don't actually move it ourselves, but get to the other side of the sun, and my goodness, the light does bend as it comes around the sun from the distant stars and galaxies. And then farther, they began to look at the very, very, very distant galaxies and how their light bends around other galaxies. And that's when they ran into a problem, because the math didn't add up. And they tested, and they searched, and they looked at things that were 13.5 billion light years away. That's a long way, folks. They looked at those things that far away, and that light coming around the intervening objects, and they discovered two things. One is that the universe is accelerating in its expansion. They figured it'd be slowing down. As things move apart, then the attraction of gravity would want to pull them back together, but no, something's pushing it out faster and faster and faster. That was a little disturbing. And then the other part that really thoroughly amazed them is that the light that bent around those intervening galaxies was bending far too much. Far too much. There's more mass in those galaxies than they thought there was. There's more mass in our galaxy than they thought there was. In fact, what we see, what we're made up of, all the things that are visible that we can test or weigh or measure or experience, the things that, remember from high school chemistry, hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, carbon, that's as far as I can go, and a whole bunch of other elements. And now they're discovering, they discovered within each of those atoms there's the nucleus, which has got a proton, electrons, protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and electrons floating around. And now they know about a whole bunch of other things, and they almost have found the Higgs boson, whatever that is, but that's the so-called God particle. I won't mention why they call it that because it's not polite. And that may be the smallest thing that they've ever found. But that's all part of what they now determine is only 4% of the universe. 96% is something else altogether that we cannot weigh or measure or see or touch. We have no idea what it does. We have no idea what it looks like. We have no way to interact with it. But we know it's there. Maybe. Sort of. So, we read today in the book of Isaiah that God has named all the stars. Look to the heavens and wonder and be amazed. And I say, how far have we come in the 2,500 years since then? Now we find out, oh, wait a minute, we know less than we ever did. The more we know, the more we find out we don't know. And that's something we've heard all our lives. It's just amazing to see, even when they reach into the farthest depths of space, this may be just scratching the surface. What does that do for us? What does it do to look at the heavens and imagine how vast they are, how enormous it is? What does it do to build that big, was it the Hadron Collider in Europe, which speeds up particles to enormous speeds and then smashes them together so that a photon might come off and we can measure it and somehow determine that's another particle of whatever stuff is. We stand in awe of that. And the more we find out about it, the more amazing it is. When you look at what goes on in the cells in our body, if it's just kind of like a balloon with water inside and things going on, that's easy to imagine, but just find out what is going on inside there with proteins being developed and squeezing through keyhole things to come out into your bloodstream and all the rest of it. Who makes this stuff up? Like, who can think of such things? And it's amazing. It's astounding. And what does that do for us? Well, look at the passage from Paul's letter to the Corinthians today and his response to the magnitude of God. I would gladly be all things to all people that I might win some. You know, there was a custom in the days of the Old Testament, I think it's in Leviticus, but it might be in Deuteronomy, where if a person was a slave, now first of all I should say that the tradition in those days amongst the people of Israel, if someone was a slave to another because they sold themselves into slavery or whatever reason, they could only be a slave for 6 years, and in the 7th year they were supposed to go free. But what happens if after those years you like it there? What if you have a really good master and who feeds you well, looks after you well, and you might decide you'll stay? And what they did was they took them to the doorpost and they put their ear against the doorpost and used an awl and poked a hole through the ear. And then you wore, it's just ear piercing, don't squint, don't grimace. They pierced the ear that way and put a particular ring through it, which indicated that this person had chosen to be a lifelong servant to that master. And they would only do that if they thought that that master was in some way wonderful, a really good person to be in the service of for the rest of their lives. When we look at the heavens and see how marvelous they are, when we think about what God has done in this creation, when we think about the times that God has touched us in our past, or touched creation in some way, as I said to the children earlier, think about God parting the Red Sea, or think about Jesus being raised from the dead. When we think about those things, are we not like those servants of old who say, Lord, I want to be your servant. Like, take me into your household. This is a good place to be. And I think that that's what was going on in the mind of the Apostle Paul. Remember how he was converted? And we talked about his conversion just a few days ago. January 25th was the conversion of St. Paul. On the road to Damascus, he met Jesus, who had been crucified and buried, and some had said he'd been raised from the dead. But Paul didn't believe that until there Jesus was confronting him face to face. At that point, Paul's life was transformed. This was too amazing. This was too marvelous. This was too wonderful for anything other than total commitment of the rest of his life to the one who he ever after called Lord. Paul gave himself into the service of Christ. It's that dedication and that awareness of the greatness of God and the wonder of God's Son, Jesus Christ, that called Paul to be a loving, lifelong servant of God, wherein he could say, I have decided that I will be all things to all people, that I might win some to Christ. Paul gave his life to the service of Christ, because of who he knew that God was. There is a song that says, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me." And I know it's a bit simple perhaps, but I remember one preacher saying, I imagine that means taking a magnifying glass so we can look closely at who God is. And perhaps when we look through magnifying glasses or big telescopes to the heavens, when we begin to look at the wonder of God and how great God is, we are, as they say in some areas, gobsmacked. We are then in a place where we appreciate how good God is. When we come together here on a Sunday morning to worship, what is it that we do? Why are we here? Why do we sing those hymns and say the words again and again and again about how great God is? We use exalted terms for God. We say wonderful things about God. We say blessing and glory and honor and thanksgiving. We say these things because we want to focus for a moment on how great God is. Not because God needs to hear it, and not because we need to say it, but simply because it is. And as we say these things, and sing these things, and hear these things, as we stand or sit in this ethereal place, and think about the wonder and marvel at the greatness of God, we're ready to put our ear to the doorpost and say, Lord, make me a permanent servant of who you are. Make me one of yours forever. May I serve you with all that I am and all that I have, every moment and every day of my life. That's why we come to worship, that we might each time be lost in wonder, love and praise, each time give ourselves afresh to God. Amen.